Years, the government inherited a housing market downturn, exacerbated by the conscious and deliberate decision of the previous government to make a series of anti-supply changes to national planning policy, including the abolition of mandatory housing targets, in a forlorn attempt to appease their anti-house building backbenchers. Because of the nature of the development cycle, the impacts of that inheritance are still showing up in the statistics. So it's no surprise to us that completions for 24-25 are under 200,000.
On that, what are your plans to address sort of improving particularly the infrastructure delivery part of Section 106?
Really good question, and this is a complex area of policy, but essentially we do think the existing system of developer contributions does have a number of strengths, certainly when compared with the alternatives. It's one of the reasons we didn't take forward, decided not to take forward the previous government's infrastructure levy that was contained in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, which we feared in opposition and took the view again in government would lead to lower amounts of affordable housing and infrastructure in the round. In terms of the NAO report, it was published on the 6th of June, incredibly detailed piece of work. I don't personally disagree with any of its key findings. It makes clear that the existing system has a number of strengths, but as you said, also that it has significant limitations, including that viability assessments can be manipulated by developers. In terms of how we are working to address those limitations, I draw the committee's attention to the fact that we're already taking action in a number of areas that are highlighted in that report. For example, the report draws attention to the impact of low up-to-date local plan coverage and the impact that's having on the ability of local authorities to coordinate the appropriate amount of developer contributions and deploy them in the right locations to meet local demand. We're obviously taking steps to drive up local plan coverage across the board. It also highlights the report the impact that capability and capacity restraints, I've already mentioned that, are having on hampering local authorities' ability to negotiate with developers and to deliver infrastructure efficiently. Again, we're taking concerted action on that front, not least by giving local authorities the power to set their own fees locally through the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. But we do recognise that the existing system of developer contributions requires further reform, and we've been very clear we remain committed to strengthening it, and we'll set out how we intend to do so in due course. But the NAO's report is a really useful prompt to our thinking in that regard.
Thank you. A couple of things that had been suggested through some of our witnesses. One was around whether the new strategic planning authorities could take an advisory role, because like you say, a lot of the issues that were raised were around capacity of particularly the smaller local authorities in having even just the expertise and the time to hold those developers to account. So whether there's a sort of bigger role for those sort of a higher tier, and also a question around, in a similar way, having a kind of a national template for sort of Section 106 agreements, so that local authorities could sort of tweak that, but ultimately have an overall national steer.
As the committee will know, the Planning and Infrastructure Bill will create these new strategic planning boards to deliver spatial development strategies in sub-regions across the country. Those SDSs will be high-level housing growth and infrastructure frameworks that will identify all the locations for development, what's the appropriate infrastructure, and there will, I think, be opportunities to achieve efficiencies in the plan-making process across those areas, for example, sharing evidence bases, pooling resources. We wouldn't expect, in terms of shading into viability in Section 106, strategic planning boards to be directly supporting local authorities with viability assessments, but SDSs will have to have delivery frameworks to deliver the infrastructure that they highlight is required to come forward in their areas, and those will have to engage with whether projects are viable and how they're to be funded. In terms of standardised Section 106, we already have gone out to consultation on proposals in one of our planning reform working papers, advocates a number of changes, but specifically asked for thoughts on standardised Section 106 agreements, but also on other things like commuted sums. And we do want to hear views on those subjects as to how we can potentially ensure that we're getting more out of the system.
When you talk about that we already encourage local authorities to work together, is that something that you actively would encourage local authorities to be doing more in order to sort of get some of these things moving in terms of working together more on Section 106 and holding developers to account?
I mean, that's a difficult question to answer in the sense it will depend on what the local authority in question and its neighbouring authorities see as their challenges or, the gaps they need to overcome.
Lewis, Thank you. Minister, so when an applicant comes forward to get outline planning permission, obviously they go through the process and they kind of set out what they're going to do with the 106 agreement, and councillors vote on that basis. They always come back when they require full planning permission and they change that 106 negotiation and say it's not viable anymore, you can't have anything that we promised you. But because obviously the development has been established in terms of planning policy, it's very difficult for councils then to say, well, hang on a minute, you've led us down the garden path, you've essentially lied to us and said you were going to develop a doctor's surgery, you were going to have a school, and now we can't have any of that. What's the government's looking at what councils can do in that situation? Because obviously when that goes to appeal, it's very difficult because they've established a principle of development by granting the outline. They won't get any 106 or hardly at all because the developer says they now can't afford it, and developers are definitely playing the system in those circumstances.
It's a good question. You tempt me, Mr. Cocking, to expand on precisely what we're looking at when it comes to strengthening the existing developer contribution system, which I'm not in a position to do. I'm more than happy to come back at the point that we set out proposals to talk through them. I think it's probably worth saying the two principal objectives in my mind to the outcomes that we want to seek when it comes to strengthening the developer contribution system are twofold. Firstly, to ensure that local authorities are in a position to negotiate more effectively with developers on those agreements. We hear from local authorities all over the country that they don't have, it comes back to the capability, capacity problem, the resourcing skills. They don't have the expertise to effectively interrogate and challenge viability assessments in the way they would like, so we've got to arm them with the capability to be able to do that. But then secondly, when agreements are reached, we've got to hold developers to those commitments and ensure they honour them. And I suppose in terms of general principles, they are the two objectives that I am looking to address when it comes to looking at how we can strengthen the system.
And the biggest player that doesn't get round the table is the National Health Service. They do not, it's very difficult to get them around the table in terms of the negotiation. What do they need when you're planning a new development, when you're going through that local plan process, to plan a new doctor's surgery, to get them even around the table to talk about what infrastructure the healthcare services need is very difficult to do. So are you giving any thought around how we can get them round the table? Because residents are crying out for loads of healthcare services and they're just not getting around the table to get any of that 106 money at all.
So I think if I've understood the point you're driving at, and again it is a valid concern, that in many instances, in fact I've got GP surgery on the Greenwich Peninsula that fits this bill. Sometimes it's about the delivery of the infrastructure. Sometimes it's about other issues. For example, GP's practice might come forward in terms of the building being constructed, but there isn't the workforce to staff it. So I take your general point and would agree that there is more that we can do to encourage greater coordination between the various infrastructure providers to ensure that development comes forward in a timely manner up front. That's one element of addressing that specific problem. I mean, we've strengthened the NPPF and the requirements in terms of delivering key social infrastructure, but things like spatial development strategies, again I come back to, in a particular sub-region will be a high-level infrastructure and investment framework so that sub-regions can come forward and say, well, we need this much provision, we need roads in these areas, how do we make them viable, how are they going to be funded and delivered? What's a coordination problem? What is a funding and viability problem? There's many aspects to this challenge.
With the education system, for example, when you're building lots of new homes, you get extra funding in the local area to ensure that there's the schools and the teachers in order to fund the extra students that there'll be. When it comes to the NHS, it doesn't seem like that funding happens. So often you end up with far lower per capita NHS spend in the places that are building or have recently been building the most houses, and the NHS doesn't catch up, which is obviously disincentive, effectively, to building new homes. Are you having conversations with the Department for Health about how they can be more appreciative of funding areas which are building significant numbers of new homes?
I think the Minister sort of described the process of getting primary care to suit new development, but it's much harder with hospitals, and because they're so big, and we're really only going to build a new hospital where you've got an area of very significant housing growth expected. So the conversation we were having with the Department for Health was, how do they estimate those areas of significant housing growth? Is there anything or further work that we could do with them to help them get their estimates more accurate in terms of areas that we know are likely to grow very sharply over the next few years? And that's exactly the conversation. So we've been having this conversation for a while, and I think now they're estimates of how they predict housing growth are much more refined as a result. And I think the announcements that they made recently about new hospitals probably reflect the areas that we expect to grow very significantly over the next few decades.
I think it is also worth saying that this isn't just confined to the NHS. I mean, this challenge, which I understand in individual honourable members' constituencies, is very real in terms of ensuring we get the right infrastructure and amenities up front in the development process to ensure we're building sustainable, thriving communities. That's a real challenge. There isn't a simple, single, easy answer to it, but we're very clear that government can do more to pull all parts of the system together to work more effectively. But it's not just the NHS. I was in a meeting on water yesterday, for example, water and wastewater infrastructure.
That's a big issue.
Yeah, I mean, the investment cycle for that is out of line with the planning cycle, and that is one of the challenges. And that situation operates across the board. I think and I sort of make a general point that perhaps gives the committee an insight into how we see that challenge fitting with the rest of the government's reform agenda. I think what is different between this government and previous governments is we have been very clear we're going to drive to universal local plan coverage across the country, and that those local plans have to be based on the revised LHN number that's set out in the National Planning Policy Framework. So as a general principle, infrastructure providers do know where the growth is coming. And this is what is, I think, less ambiguous than the previous parliaments, where you might have just said, just account for adopted sites in a local plan. Every part of the country knows that they're expected to, in fairly short order, get a local plan in place that is based, in lots of cases, on that revised LHN number. And therefore, there shouldn't be, I think, in the way that there perhaps has been in the past, any ambiguity about the amount of growth you need to be catering for, whether it's in terms of NHS provision, water, wastewater, any other form of infrastructure or amenity.
Lewis, very quickly, I'm keen for us to move on.
There's no simple answer, but there is. You could legislate and say that you must build infrastructure first for any new housing that's built. You must build the school, the GPs, the roads before you build any housing. That is a simple solution. You could choose to do that.
I think that's an overly simplistic solution that would have a range of unintended consequences, Mr. Cooking. I put it no more forcefully than that.
Lewis.
So you seem to be putting a lot of emphasis on local plans and local plan policies. So are you going to change the guidance to the planning inspectors so they don't approve development that is not local plan compliant? Because there's a number of examples, probably from across the country, where development comes forward, gets approval, and it's not local plan compliant. So it may be in the local plan, but doesn't meet the affordable housing policy, doesn't meet a number of policies within that local plan. And obviously, because you're putting more emphasis on the local plans, are you going to change the guidance to the planning inspector so when things go to appeal, that they're not going to be approved if they're not local plan policy compliant?
I mean, clearly there's a difference between where local plans are up to date and therefore those policies hold the weight you'd expect them to, which is true currently for just over a third of authorities, and then authorities where those plan policies are not up to date or there isn't even a adopted local plan in existence. Clearly one of the things we're making a big push on and want to see is that plan adoption, but I'll leave that point for now. On that split, therefore, where a local plan is not up to date or doesn't exist, then clearly national policy has the weight you'd expect it to have, and the presumption might apply, and you would expect to see that development come forward.
I've got a number of examples in my own constituency. We've got an up-to-date local plan, and things will win on appeal, even though it doesn't meet loads of local plan policies.
So, obviously, I can't comment on the specific, but it's also true, of course, that where national policy has been updated in the interim, then weight can be given to national policy alongside the plan, and that is a judgment for both the decision maker when it's the authority and PINS if it's an appeal. And in those instances, it may be the case that the weight of national policy is an important consideration. That is a general comment, obviously, that I can't comment on the specific.
I'd add to that in the sense of just reinforcing what Will said, in that every planning application decision is a decision by the decision maker or PINS on appeal as to a planning judgment in the round based on material considerations, where national policy has significant weight. I think the other thing I'd add is, and we did test this through our some of the working paper we published on modernising planning committees, it is quite difficult, and I do recognise that sort of challenge Ms. Cocking you've thrown out. I've had it in my own constituency. It is harder than you would think in practice to judge whether a particular application is either fully compliant with or not fully compliant with a local plan.
Forward now onto the decent homes standard and the work going on there. It's been made public that this might not be enforceable until 2035 or 2037. we have had 72 children die due to their living conditions between 2019 and 2024. So why would there be this delay, and why are we not pushing as quickly as possible to make every landlord responsible for making sure that the homes that the families are living in this country while they await the progress of this building programme are fit for human habitation?
I think it's important to say, as a point of principle, alongside our commitment to delivering the biggest increase in social and affordable house building in a generation, we're absolutely committed to driving a transformational change in the safety and quality of housing. I think the action that we've taken today attests to that. When it comes to the consultation that we've recently released, one on MEES as well, but an updated and modernised decent home standard, which will include a new damp and mould standard, you're right that we sought views on an implementation date of 2035, 2037. That is not particularly unusual, I'd add, just to draw the committee's attention to the Decent Homes programme undertaken by the last Labour government, which had a 10-year implementation timeline. The sector does need time to respond to that. But in terms of your challenge on what are we doing for people potentially living with acute hazards, we have taken urgent action, particularly in terms of damp and mould, in both sectors, social rented sector and the private rented sector, by introducing AWAB's law, for which we laid the regulations on the 25th of June. And subject to parliamentary scrutiny, that first phase of AWAB's law will come into force in October, and that will require landlords to address significant damp and mould hazards and emergency hazards within fixed periods. So we're taking very short-term action, but I think it's entirely right and proper that we give the sector time to implement, as we did with the Decent Homes programme under the last Labour government, which had hugely positive effects. There's no way you could ask for an updated standard to be implemented within, say, a year. We do need a lead-in time to bring those standards, but we're taking urgent action through AWAB's law, through the regulator, to improve standards in the short term.
Perhaps not within a year, but to be waiting 10 years seems extreme, given the money that is being made in this sector and the responsibility every single landlord should have to provide a home with running water, free from damp and mould, and not free from rat infestations. So surely there could be greater urgency than 2035.
I'd simply sort of reinforce, perhaps you take issue with this, I think we have acted urgently by laying regulations on AWAB's law, which, as I've said, will require landlords to address hazards, including damp and mould.
You'll be aware the emails we all receive.
I receive them too, Chair.
You receive them as well, Minister. That's not the situation on the ground for many tenants.
What's not the situation?
In terms of the regulations,
they haven't come into force yet, Chair.
And even when they do come into force, local authorities are telling us they do not feel well resourced to be able to carry out those inspections. Do you feel that we'll have a situation in October where essentially private residents will feel that local authorities are going to be able to come in to inspect these, and local authorities in turn are going to come back to the government to say we cannot keep up with these inspections?
The whole point of AWAB's law, Chair, is that if landlords don't meet these requirements, residents will be able to hold them to account by taking legal action through the courts. It imposes a very, very hard, fixed time period for responses to hazards like damp and mould. This is a significant intervention. We've laid the regs, they're not in force.
The courts are going to be able to deal with those
we do feel it's precisely
that are going to come forward.
Precisely why we've taken a sequenced approach to implementing AWAB's law, to ensure that the sector can manage it, and that, for example, responding to AWAB's law cases doesn't completely consume the repairs and maintenance departments of all local authorities, for example. We are confident the sector can implement this properly. It is a significant change that will deal with hazards like damp and mould, will improve quality and safety. And then at the same time, as we've got that emergency measure in place, we're going to raise standards across the board through an upgraded and modernised decent home standard, on the timelines of, as I said, the previous Labour government's Decent Homes programme. And I don't think anyone at that point in time would have been saying, I think you should need to get on with it and do it in 2
Minister,
years.
We now have a situation where we have almost 2 million people on housing waiting lists. We're seeing local authorities spend 2.29 billion. I don't need to read these figures to you. The situation is getting dire.
Thank you. An issue that is always in the news, leasehold reform. Will.
Thank you, Chairman. Minister, can you commit to ending the leasehold system and implementing the Law Commission's proposals in full during this Parliament?
Yes, we will finally bring the feudal leasehold system to an end in this Parliament. That's our commitment, set out very clearly in the written ministerial statement I issued last year. The reason we're consulting is if you will see, if you go and take a look at that 100-plus page consultation document, this is an incredibly technical area. It is important that we get it right to ensure that the measures work in practice, that they're of lasting benefit to leaseholders and tenants. And you'll know that that consultation also proposes further leasehold reforms beyond service charges and legal costs, for example, reforming the major works process, the regulation of managing agents via mandatory qualifications.
I think I and probably other members of the committee got contacted by a lot of leaseholders really worried that they are going to be let down by this government, like that have been let down by the previous government, that this government came in, clearly said you would abolish leaseholds, fully support that. There's a huge fear that last week's consultations, because you aren't actually going to deliver the comprehensive form that you promised. And I think that's why I'm asking, because my inbox is full of leaseholders that are really concerned that actually you're not going to follow through on your promise. It would be another broken one.
But I don't think, to just directly address your point, I don't think there's any cause among leaseholders in the country to doubt this government's commitment to bring the system to an end by the end of this Parliament. And barring a slight change in our timetable for the consultation on valuation rates, which I'm more than happy to address, we're on course to do exactly what we said in that written ministerial statement in terms of progressively switching on the various provisions of that 2024 Act and introducing the wider reforms. So I don't know what the cause is on leaseholders' part to doubt our commitment. We're doing exactly what we said in that detailed WMS in terms of the roadmap for bringing the system to an end by the end of this Parliament.
I appreciate what you said. I think, try to understand it from a leaseholder's point of view, they've had promises broken time and time again. They felt trampled by management companies. You can't be surprised that there is a lack of trust there.
No, I don't in any way take issue, and I'm not surprised by the lack of trust. You're absolutely right that leaseholders have been let down on multiple occasions by previous governments that committed to far-reaching reform and then didn't enact it. Leaseholders should judge us by our works, I would say, at the end of this Parliament, by which point we will have brought the system to an end, given those leaseholders existing leaseholders, rights protections that they so desperately need in the here and now. Service charges are a good example of that, but undertaking those wider reforms to bring the system to an end, in particular ensuring that common hold is the default tenure going forward.
Finally, Minister, thank you for your time. Just as obviously you will be aware, last week the CMA investigation where 7 major house builders and the settlement on the alleged anti-competitive process. Just wanted to know if you or your civil servants were involved in the negotiations and looking at that settlement. And actually, do you think that's a satisfactory outcome? 110 million between those 7 developers it's not really going to act as a deterrent, is it?
Could I bring Joe and Will in on civil service involvement first?
Yeah, I mean, the CMA is an entirely independent organisation, so we don't get involved in their discussions and with the house builders about what was going on with their market investigation or indeed in the remedy that they agreed with the house builders. The conversation that we did have with the CMA was in very, very practical terms. They asked us if there were to be a sum of money forthcoming, did we have a sort of route for it to go to social and affordable housing? And that was a conversation that we had on a confidential basis.
Okay, so that 100 million split between 7 developers.
We didn't have a conversation about the amount or anything of that nature. That was entirely a matter for the CMA.
Okay. Just, I appreciate their independence, but did the department seek any advice in terms of the evidence they've collated and to help sort of any policy changes that you'd want to make going forward?
This was entirely an independent CMA report, and the sort of remedies that they've discussed with the house builders are between the CMA and the house builders, not for the department.
Okay, so
I suppose I'd say generally, Chair, to add, as you'd expect, with a government that is determined to fix our broken housing market, of course we're going to reflect on incidents like this, and you will see, for example, in the long-term housing strategy that is forthcoming, precisely the ways in which we want to address aspects of that broken housing market and, for example, end our over-reliance on a speculative development model that is not driving good outcomes in many instances.